Welcome to episode number 23 with Mark Kalch, recently voted one of the top 50 most adventurous men in the world.
We'd reached these rapids that were really tough, and really quite scary, and they're deep in these canyons. There's no villages, there's nothing around. If there was a village, it's probably a vertical kilometer above you, more or less, and often you couldn't even leave this canyon because it's just too steep. Even if I would have decided to leave, that would have left my two friends to take on this rapids that I was afraid would kill me.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. Today, the show takes a little bit of a different turn, and I interviewed one of the most adventurous men in the world. He was voted by Men's Journal as one of the top 50 most adventurous men in the world. So I interviewed Mark from his home in Argentina, and Mark is in the middle of a quest. It's a series of epic adventures that he's doing via feet and by kayak. He has kayaked the entire length of the Amazon. He's gone down the Volga River, which is the largest and longest river in Europe. He's gone down the Mississippi from source to sea. And also he's walked across Iran. So this is a project that takes multiple years, and there's a lot to learn from Mark. Now, nobody in the show is probably listening about how they switch careers from an executive at home with being a father, mother, and then all of a sudden going and becoming an expedition type individual. However, I think there's a huge amount to be learned about getting outside of our roles and planning something that's interesting and planning something that's fun and different in your life. And I personally have been on a river that kind of scared me quite a bit. And I brought my son on it, and we weren't in risk of losing our lives. However, people's lives had been lost on that river, but it was a blast. And it was something that pushed my comfort zone. And I literally feel different when I get back after doing my adventures. I feel more connected, more empowered in all areas of my life. And so I feel that when I look and I interview someone like Mark, we have the opportunity to see someone at the apex and be able to say, okay, even if I can do 0.5%, 1%, 2%, 5% of what that person is doing, what benefits would it bring to my life? And asking yourself what benefits can bring to your life individually. So some of the main takeaways from today are going to be, what about children? How do children benefit from being in nature? He talks about the U.S. Park Service and the opportunities for accessing rivers and camping and river rafting, and how you can translate river adventures into the boardroom and how you can translate it for busy executives. How do you deal with voices that tell you can't or that you must quit? And why being on a river is a form of medicine. And a little bit about Russian people coming down the Volga River. What was it like for him to be exposed to Russian people and also the people of Iran, walking across Iran? What was that like? In today's day, the media portrays Iran as evil. But what about just the normal, regular people? So these are the exposures that Mark talks about that he experienced, and he encourages us and you to do the same. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with him. And my hope is that in this interview, that it will spur you on to try your own personal and family adventure on your own someday. So let's get into the program. This episode is brought to you by Red Zone Technologies. Red Zone is a security backstop. Baseball fields have backstops to prevent the ball from going out of play. A backstop typically has no holes in it, so the ball is kept in the park. Often there are holes in an IT security program. Everyone, however, has an opinion regarding how to plug these holes. Audit, both internal and external, your staff, regulators, integrators, consultants, etc. It is Red Zone's job to understand all the opinions and help you make appropriate IT security investment decisions that are based on risk and criticality, and not emotion, media, or FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We are here to ensure you make solid and defensible decisions with architecture, design, processes, hardware, software, cloud and hybrid cloud services, and managed security services. So go to redzonetech.net to learn more about my team's ability to help you. And again, that is redzonetech.net. Now on with the show.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to ask you a couple questions, and one of them is, was there a defining moment, like when you were a kid growing up, is there a defining moment that you said, I'm going to be someone who does expeditions as a life quest?
I wish I could say that there was, some sort of moment, but I don't think there was. Not a single particular moment anyway. I grew up in Australia, on the east coast of Australia, right on the beach. So on our front door was the Pacific Ocean, and then at our back door is the Australian bush, the I'm not sure what else to call it, the forest, the jungle sort of thing out the back. So I grew up in a small town as well, and apart from sort of being outside and doing things either in the ocean or in the bush, there wasn't a hell of a lot that young people could do, more or less. So I guess in some ways it was built into me, but certainly I was just a normal ratbag kid growing up who wanted to leave this small town that I grew up in. But I would say that if there wasn't a single moment, then all of my childhood was sort of built around being outside in one way or another.
So when you were in school in Australia, can you take me back to, like, how did you progress through school? Like, did you go to normal, I guess would be the equivalent of high school and college, and then decide to veer off after that? Or how did you end up so that you are full-time leading and building to expeditions?
Yeah, I went to high school, and then I actually didn't do too well in high school. I got a bit distracted by playing sport and things like that, and I actually took a year off, and I just worked and in some pretty menial jobs. And I realized pretty quickly that doing those sorts of jobs that I did wasn't really where I wanted to sort of spend the rest of my life. So I went back to a college, so to speak, and really improved my grades to a ridiculously high level for me anyway, and easily got into university, and I studied sports science, which was and still is a big interest of mine. And I guess it was sometime when I was at university that I got to travel overseas for an extended period. And I had a friend who was running a river guiding operation in South Africa. So I went to visit him and hung out with him on this river that he was running the operation on. And I think that was certainly the clincher for me, that I realized, one, that I really want to check out the rest of the world, in quite a meaningful way. And two, that rivers, water, and certainly rivers were going to be a big part of it. And then, just progress slowly from there, from being a guide on rivers for, commercial operations, and then slowly doing some bigger and more difficult trips with my friends who are also guides. And then the next step up from that was doing these rather large expeditions that I do now.
Well, just a little story, as I talked to you about before the show, I love you to share one of the stories, because what I find so fascinating is that I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and just a couple summers ago, I think my son was 9 or 10 at the time, I just said, let's hop in the Jeep and just start driving. And we started driving, and we got to a hotel, stayed the night, and then we just kept on going into the hills of Pennsylvania. And we went to a river called the Youghiogheny River. And I lied about his age, and they let me go on the rafting. There's a couple of river guides companies there that took you on rafting trips down the river, and it was really low. It was late in August. It was about 100 degrees out, and it was probably like 1 foot or 2 feet over, I guess, the low level or whatever. But I was stunned at the power of this river, and I was like, I said to myself after, I now know why they didn't let kids under 12 go on this trip, but we were so dependent on that guide that was in the boat, and they were so skilled at navigating down this river, and it was complete thrill to go down it. And So it's really interesting because you're like at a completely other end of the spectrum. But maybe you could share like what is it that you get from the river that keeps you going back and keeps you coming back for more?
Well, I think it's a few things. It's funny that you mentioned that about the realizing the power of these rivers, because for me, experiencing a lot of different types of rivers, from flat water rivers that are really big volume, so really wide but flat water, to lower volume but very steep white water stuff. To me, and I guess to anyone who's a whitewater guide or a whitewater paddler or even a flat water paddler, you get to learn to read the river. And so now when I look at a river, even if I'm not there to paddle it, immediately my eyes are drawn to the different features in the river, and probably immediately I'm sort of in my mind choosing a line that I would take down this river, even if I'm driving over a bridge to get just over this river. And I sometimes forget that to maybe people who haven't been on a river or done much paddling, even commercial rafting or anything, that being able to distinguish those features and sort of really understand the power of a river and what goes on underneath the river, the dynamics, I really have to remind myself that's not an automatic sort of thing that it obviously has become for me and for other guys who spend a lot of time on a river. And so I think that's definitely a big draw to me, is that's just the perpetual energy or power that a river has. I mean, besides a river that, that might run dry, which is a really unfortunate thing to happen, more or less these things of nature that run continuously. And I think that's a pretty special thing. And it's also the fact that you can get on a river in a kayak, in a raft, stand-up paddleboard, whatever you want. You can reach places and access places that you just can't reach in any other way. Definitely not by car. Some places perhaps on foot, but because due to the nature of the terrain on either side of the river, it might be too dense like a jungle or too steep like a canyon, and you just can't reach those places unless you're on the river. And that makes it pretty special as well. And I guess the final thing is the view or the perspective you get when you're on a river and looking out. Just this past summer, I paddled the Volga River in Russia from source to sea. And certainly going down the longest and largest river in Europe and meeting people in that fashion, I would come around a bend in the river and there'd be some Russian people camped themselves, with their cars and things camped by the river. And to have this guy appear out of nowhere in a kayak, it was a bit of a surprise to them. So it sort of allowed me to interact with them in a way that I wouldn't have been able to interact with them if I had just turned up in a car. So I think all those things, a combination of those things is definitely the draw for me. And I think if other people get to experience even one of those different things, then they would certainly develop an interest in paddling and in rivers as well.
So for our listeners, and I think that would be good to talk about, you mentioned the Volga rivers in Russia. So you have a project going on right now, which is called Seven Rivers, Seven Continents, correct?
Correct, that's right.
So you've completed, like in 2008, going up and down the Amazon, or maybe you can just tell us what you've completed so far, and then go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So the Seven Rivers, Seven Continents project is, something that I thought up, or more accurately, my girlfriend or my partner, she thought of it. So we made a source-to-sea descent of the Amazon River, myself and two friends, in 2007, 2008, and that was a really tough descent. It took 153 days. Of course, the upper Amazon is some pretty gnarly white water, and then even on the flat water, spending 3 months or more on this flat water of the Amazon, where it's sometimes 20, 30 miles wide, is a pretty sort of amazing thing. And then in 2012, I headed to the US and I paddled from source to sea the Missouri, Mississippi. So I started up in Montana and paddled all the way across Montana, north towards the Canadian border, and then down through North, South Dakota, and across to where the Missouri meets the Mississippi, and then headed more or less south where the river empties out into the Gulf of Mexico. Also around 4,000 miles, similar length to the Amazon, a little bit shorter, and that took me 117 days. I was by myself, just in my kayak. Also, very interesting trip for me. It was my first time in the US, which was pretty cool. And then last year, 2014, I also made a solo descent of the longest river in Europe, which is the Volga River. It's about 2,300 miles long. Took me 71 days, and I think all these rivers that I've done so far have a special place in my mind, in my heart. But Volga was really interesting, perhaps because of the unexpected, I guess, beauty of the river. 95% of it, even maybe more, is, to the eye at least, is pristine, beautiful river. And then I guess the other sort of unexpected thing that, was the people of Russia. I grew up in Australia, and the Cold War and all this sort of media stuff that we're fed about Russia being a sort of a bit of a harsh, cold country, and obviously the people maybe as well. And it was the exact opposite. The only other country, I think, for me anyway, that could compare with the generosity and the openness and the willingness to help of the Russian people would, funnily enough, be the people of Iran. In 2010, I actually walked across Iran from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. So that wasn't on a river; it was just on foot for 2 months. So yeah, Russia and the Volga was pretty special. So that leaves me with 4 still to go. So not quite halfway, but certainly it's a multi-year project, and it's something that I've sort of really committed myself to now. So I've got to finish it now.
This is a multi-year quest for you.
In the way that it's named, 7 rivers, 7 continents, it actually sounds a little bit like 7 summits, which is, of course, summiting the highest mountain on every continent, which is a cool thing. I'm not much of a climber. I used to climb a bit, but I've really obviously concentrated on paddling for the last few years. And the 7 Summits is a great project in itself. But, I think for me, the biggest thing that differentiates between making source-to-sea descent of the longest river on each continent or summiting the highest mountain on each continent is that there's no outfitters, there's no guiding companies that will take you down these rivers. Obviously, there's short sections on some rivers where you can join a commercial group, but, it's for 40 miles, 100 miles sort of trip, whereas the 7 summits, you can Google the outfitters, right now, and there's tens, maybe hundreds, maybe not hundreds, but tens of companies who have 7 summits packages. So more or less you hand over your money, and if you're lucky with the weather, if you've trained hard, then these guys will take you up these mountains. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I think I would prefer to think of it as fortunately, no one really offers that service for these rivers. They're just a bit long, and they just take a bit long to descend, and maybe people don't find them exciting enough. To be fair, when you're spending 100+ days floating down a river and 14 hours a day paddling, I'll admit sometimes it can get a little bit boring and a little bit lonely. But I think once you reach the ocean, it sort of, it was all worth it.
Well, I know our listeners are out there trying to do their own mini adventures, even if it's not of the extent you are. But I think we all have these voices that go off in our head. I know when I was doing an Ironman, I've done a couple, and out at 100 miles on the bike, I know in my head I was saying, "What are you doing out here?" And,
Yeah.
And then I think I was on this 7-day survival school trip that was in the middle of Utah, and like day 4 in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I got it. I understand what's involved here. It's time to go home. But of course you can't. You're in the middle of like nowhere. So
exactly.
How do you deal with those voices?
Yeah, you definitely get those as well. On the Amazon, the upper Amazon, this whitewater, I went through quite a few of those times. Fortunately, I was at that time. There was 3 of us. We were in a team. We'd reached these rapids that were really tough. And really quite scary. And they're deep in these canyons. There's no villages. There's nothing around. If there was a village, it's probably a vertical kilometer above you, more or less. And often you couldn't even leave this canyon because it's just too steep. Even if I would have decided to leave, that would have left my 2 friends to take on this rapids that I was afraid would kill me. So it just wasn't, I wasn't going to let do that to my friends, So in some ways, that was a fairly easy decision to make. I think when I've done my journeys on my own, the Volga, the Missouri, Mississippi, and as I mentioned, walking across Iran, it would have been pretty easy to give up, when it got hard, and those thoughts do enter your head. But I don't know, I guess again it's a combination of things. your mind does get a bit twisted as to the degree of difficulty that you're going through. And, the very next day you're floating down the river. Maybe it's been raining or it's been a storm and finally it's lifted and you've got blue sky, but the sun's setting, and you remind yourself exactly where you are. For example, I distinctly remember many times on the Volga River, maybe I had just floated down past a big city like Volgograd, which used to be known as Stalingrad, and there's massive Soviet cities, and the sun setting, and I knew that I was pretty confident finding a really nice campsite, and you just have to remind yourself that I'm floating down this giant river in Russia, and how fortunate I am to be there. So it just sort of be a bit of a waste and a bit silly of me to say, okay, it's gotten a bit hard now, I'm going home. I guess I use certain ways to rationalize this thinking of giving up in a few different ways. And of course, there's also the other thing, because I do this as my job, it's not just my family and friends that know that I gave up. It's a bit of a larger audience. And if you are going to pull the plug on one of these trips, which can happen, then you better have a pretty good reason, And for me, the only reason would be pretty serious injury, like extremely serious injury. I know a lot of tough guys who have been injured on expedition and just push on. So I think of them as well. And if they wouldn't give up, then I shouldn't have to either. So, yeah, it definitely enters your head, but you find a few sort of different techniques to get around it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You have a big reason why. So what I've just listened to is essentially you have you're grateful to be there to your sponsors and your family and the folks that you let down in the process.
Exactly.
So Iran, from just the general political climate, because this was a couple of years ago, how did you gain entry to Iran? And then can you give us like a day in the life, what it was like to walk across Iran, and what were the people like? And did you ever get afraid you were going to be put in prison?
No, it was a funny time actually. When I was headed there, it was actually just after when they had the disputed elections in Iran, and there was a bit of an uprising with the Green movement. Ahmadinejad, he was voted in again, and there was talk, of vote rigging and things like that. So it was sort of on the cusp of one of these. It was even before all the Arab Spring, which began in Tunisia and then went on to Libya and Egypt and these things. This was actually before then. But there was definitely some unrest with pro-government demonstrations, anti-government demonstrations. But I got there probably about a month or two after the elections, and certainly there were still protests going on. But I just had a regular visa. I was quite fortunate in a few ways. And again, it really, I guess, comes down to the amount of time I can spend preparing for these trips and the amount of research that I can put in. Generally, for a tourist, if you're lucky, you can get a 30-day visa. I hear lots of stories of people applying for a 30-day visa, and when they get their visa back, they've got a visa, which is, pretty cool, but they look and the government has only given them 10-day visa, which is a real shame. I was really fortunate in that I had a host in Iran, which was the Alpine Club of Iran. They really looked after me with a letter of invitation and sort of acted as my representative in the country. So that definitely helped in getting my visa, and secondly, in being able to extend it. If you are fortunate to get a month-long visa to Iran, at the time anyway, you could extend that visa twice up to 90 days. And more or less, I thought that was enough time to walk across Iran via the route that I had planned from the northern border to the south to the Persian Gulf. So I got there and I was introduced to a few people who were all outdoors people, mountaineers. They own mountain guiding businesses and things like that. And then I headed up to the Caspian Sea on the water there, and then just more or less headed south. First crossing the Elborz Mountains, where Iran's highest mountain is, which is a pretty big mountain. It's over 5,000 meters, and I was actually there when there was a lot of snow around, which made it a bit interesting to cross those mountains with a lot of snow. But almost immediately, when I began meeting people, the welcome couldn't have been more friendly. In part, that was just sort of how they meet everyone or greet everyone. And secondly, I think they were just so stoked that this guy had come here to, well, I guess one, walk across Iran, which is a pretty strange thing to do for anyone, but two, a big part of it for me was to find out about the real Iran. I guess the same as you guys in the US. I grew up in Australia, and we were fed the sort of, I guess, the same sort of media line as sort of, I guess, was fed to the UK and the US, that Iran is this, bad place, and, it's very anti-Western, and could not be further from the truth. There are certain elements, of course, in the government and in certain groups in Iran which are fairly anti-West, to say the least. But as far as the majority, the vast majority of the population, super liberal. It just sort of makes me laugh that Australia, the UK, and the US were allies with much, much more hardline regimes and countries for whatever political reasons. But for so many years, we were happy to call out Iran for being hardline. And as I said, the majority of the population are not. People would meet me and they'd say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say Australia, and they'd say, "Oh, my cousin owns a shop in Sydney," or my uncle moved 20 years ago to California, and I can't wait to go and visit him. There was no anti-Western sort of sentiment whatsoever. So at no time did I feel that the police or anything were sort of out to get me. I got stopped by the police all the time, and all they did was bring me inside and feed me tea and biscuits. That was about as harsh as it got. And to be fair, I was there at the same time that the 3 US hikers were in Evin prison in Tehran. I'm not sure if you remember, they accidentally crossed over the border from Iraq into Iran, and they spent 400 and something days, or at least the 2 boys did, in the prison. So people were a bit worried that something might happen to me, but I was fully legitimately visaed up and things like that. So yeah, it was a really nice trip and real eye opener as well. To me now, Iran, it's one of my favorite countries. The people and certainly the geography of it as well. And I would love to go back, and hopefully now with the progression that's been made with these nuclear talks, then it will really open it up to more people much more easily.
Oh yeah, I love hearing your stories about these different locations, especially Iran. It's like you walked right into the kind of the jaws, so to speak, metaphorically.
Yeah.
Of all of your trips so far, which one, like if you had to say it was a percentage of questions, which one do you get the most percentage of questions about?
Probably, unfortunately, I don't know. Again, I'm sort of torn on it, but often when I did a podcast a couple of months ago, I can't remember if it was the end of last year or earlier this year, with Boyd Matson from Nat Geo Radio, and we chatted beforehand about the things we were going to talk about and stuff, and pretty much for our entire segment, we talked about the whitewater, the danger of the whitewater on the Amazon, which I can understand. That danger and death-defying stuff is immediately, I guess, interesting for people. I fully understand that. And so certainly Amazon is what probably people ask me the most about. It's probably the most famous sort of thing, but to me, and while it was super interesting, and, for me, the Amazon's a special river because it sort of was the catalyst for me moving on to all these other rivers. So it's a really special place for me. Besides, I almost died there many times, so it's definitely got good and bad memories. But the Missouri, Mississippi, which I guess for people in the US, it's the Missouri, it's the Mississippi, people live along this river. But, I got to do things in the US which, while being fairly run-of-the-mill for a lot of people, to me, in terms of I guess a cultural interaction, I stayed with some friends in Memphis, Tennessee, and to sort of resupply and sort of have a bit of a rest. I was there for a few days, and I remember it was on a Sunday, and they asked me if I wanted to come to church with them. And I'm not a religious guy, I'm sort of open-minded, but certainly not religious. I don't go to church or anything. And I said, sure. I knew that I'm pretty sure Memphis is Bible Belt sort of area.
Yeah.
And so that day they took me to church. I was thinking, church. I went to I'm not sure of the correct terminology, but a mega church. So it has a sort of a crowd capacity of, I'm not sure, 15,000 people. There's television broadcast live happening while the church service is going on. There was a lot of people with their hands in the air. Quite a big sort of thing. And as I said, I'm not a religious guy, but those couple of hours I got to spend at that church was as interesting as me spending time with a family deep in on the Amazon River sort of thing, because for me that was a cultural interaction that I had never experienced before. So to me, that's super interesting. But I can understand that people might not ask questions about the time I went to church in Memphis, Tennessee. So it's tough for me, but I can understand why people might ask about the Amazon a lot.
Well, some of the audience, our audience listening to this, are just traditional business executives, and I've often thought, just in talking to you, if you had 100 ladies and gentlemen in a room that are just sort of living normal lives, and they had sort of their regular vacation each year with their kids, and they had an opportunity to spend a couple days, a week, maybe 2 weeks, doing something that was interesting, either culturally, just as you explained, or a river expedition or something, a hike somewhere. Like, what would you say to this group of 100 in order for them to help them get started?
I think, first of all, the benefit that you could wrangle 2 weeks away. I understand if people are in a hectic business environment that they're getting 2 weeks away from work is sometimes tough. But, if you can swing a few things, that maybe, 2 weeks is a good chunk of time. And certainly I think I can picture it now, what I would personally do, certainly if I was in the US. In the US, you guys have such an abundance of rivers and such an abundance of wild rivers. So being able to find 2 weeks, the first thing that I would do is to look into an outfitter that offers these sort of extended journeys. And it could be from somewhere, quite well known, maybe the Colorado River or something like this, but equally there's a lot of other rivers in North America, in the US and in Canada and in Alaska, US, that you can go on. And certainly there's outfitters that will sort the whole thing out for you. You bring all your personal gear and then you float for 2 weeks. If it's just yourself and maybe some friends or some guys from work, then you can do rivers that might have a high degree of difficulty. Equally, if it's you and the kids or you and the whole rest of the family, equally you can float a river that has minimal white water. But for those 2 weeks or week or whatever, you're camping by the side of this river, you're fishing, you're floating down this river. At night you're looking up at a billion stars. And to me, the worth and I see it as a form of sort of, I don't know, medicine or something like that, that what you get from that week or 2 weeks away from, I guess, the traditional sort of work environment, the benefits are immeasurable. For me, I think if you worked for the first 5.5 months of the year and then took 2 weeks to go off and do a really nice river trip, the next 6 months of your working year are going to be a breeze, and they're also, I would imagine, to be some of the most productive and the most enjoyable 6 months that you could ever do. And I think for a lot of people, once they do go on these trips, they realize that, and they do then make it, at the very least, an annual thing. So I think they just have to really go out there and do it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that my little experience, which was so profound, and then going and being out of the Grand Canyon last year and seeing the options that were available on the river there, and being near the Colorado and having traveled there, I think that you're spot on. And I think the recovery from that 2 weeks, you're right. The second half of the year would look nothing like the first half.
Oh, for sure.
And what's interesting is you have a movie trailer on your site. I think it was on your Seven Rivers site, or maybe it was on your markculch.com, but it was the Norm Miller. I guess Norm Miller was a legend on the Mississippi River, but he said does the growth that you go through from these expeditions or being on the river is not necessarily when you're on the river immediately. I guess, is it afterwards? Is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, for sure. That little clip, yeah, I have to recall. That's a really great little clip. I'm gonna have to watch it again. Actually, Normie's he is a legend, but he's a good friend of mine now. He lives in Livingston, Montana, so just near Bozeman. Actually, really close to Three Forks, which is where the three rivers come together to form the Missouri by name. And then a little further upstream is the actual source. You know, a lot of people do start their Missouri descents at Three Forks because that's where the Missouri begins by name. But I think last year, the year before, a couple of guys went down the Missouri, and Norm's become a bit of a legend. He himself actually paddled the Missouri from St. Louis upstream over the divide, and then paddled down the Columbia. So he was retracing Lewis and Clark in their steps. So it's hard enough to paddle down the Missouri, so let alone paddling up it. So he's a pretty hardcore paddler. But certainly what he does now and what he's become legendary for is helping people who begin their trips on the Missouri River. But that little saying, that little clip that was filmed by these two guys is definitely so true. You know, I think often on these rivers you are busy you're busy paddling, you're busy sort of moaning your way through another tough day. When you finish and you're sort of thrust back into the real world, and it does gradually dawn on you, one, what you've achieved, and not even in a record-breaking sense. You know, there's been the Missouri, Mississippi. You know, certainly sounds made up to me, but as far as we know, I was the first person in history. It sounds ridiculous to do a source to sea paddling descent of the Missouri, Mississippi, which sounds strange. So to me, that is such a minor thing that I don't even think about. So far away from record breaking or anything like that. But the enormity of what you have gone through on a personal level, just I guess starts to kick in. You know, once you're back in the real world and you think, well, what now, sort of thing. I've done this, so what do I do next? And it doesn't mean that you are going to go on and do maybe what I've gone on to do to make it a really big part of my life. But I think, you know, you can take these sort of experiences on a river and what you've gone to and just sort of realize that, you know, you can do whatever you want to do. You can achieve whatever you really want to achieve. And I'm not personally one of those guys that likes to equate or make a direct correlation between difficult expeditions and the boardroom. You know, I've got plenty of friends that are really good at making that sort of connection, but I'm definitely a huge believer in taking those experiences and I guess the emotions and whether it's physical or psychological, those sorts of things that you've gone through on a big or a difficult journey, and then applying them to other areas of your life, for sure, you know.
Yeah, I love hearing that. And it looks like from your site, you also have a daughter that I saw paddling with. And I'm assuming that's your daughter. How do you integrate all that?
It's definitely become hard. I think when I went off and did the Amazon, I had no kids. When I went off and walked across Iran, my girlfriend was pregnant, and now I've got three kids. I
Oh,
have
wow.
I have a son. He's 4.5. My daughter, well, he's almost 5. He's come up 5. My daughter is coming up 3.5, and my youngest daughter, she's just 7 months. So certainly now for me to disappear for extended periods of time is, for me personally, is by far the most difficult aspect of my journeys. You know, when I paddled the Missouri, Mississippi, I was away from home for probably, I guess, 5 months. And it was really tough being away from the kids, for sure. You know, when I get back, of course, they've grown a lot. And then the same on the Volga last year. I was gone for 4 months, and I'm away from the kids again. But, you know, I sort of, the way I can sort of rationalize it is that when I am around, I'm pretty much around the kids full time. So I see them when they wake up in the morning. I see them a lot throughout the day because I'm often working from home. I see them when they get home from school, or I pick them up from school. So I'm around a lot. And the way that, you know, I try and sort of share what I do with them is introduce them to the outdoors. At times it can be difficult where we are now in Buenos Aires, which is this massive mega city. But luckily, Argentina as a country has some of the best outdoors and most amazing mountains and rivers in the entire world. So in January, we took off for a whole month, the whole family, the little baby, everyone, and we spent a month camping down in Patagonia. And I took my stand-up paddleboard, and yeah, it was really amazing. The kids just, it just blew their minds. They loved camping. They loved, we'd have a fire, and by day we'd explore along these lakes and rivers, and I'd take the kids out paddling, which is that there's a good little clip of Josie, my daughter, just laughing the entire time. And, it was just really special, and again, I've got friends in the UK who's, I guess their main activity is really brilliant, and what that is championing or really pushing for children to be exposed to nature, to the outdoors from a much younger age, and also much more throughout their lives. The kids end up in, particularly city kids or kids who live in urban environments, end up in these classrooms, they end up in these shopping malls and TVs and Xbox and these sorts of things, and just don't really get to experience this side of things. And particularly this month in Patagonia for me, it really reinforced what benefits being close to nature for kids can be. Me as an adult, I get to do it all the time because I just say, yep, I'm going to go and paddle this big river, or today I'm going to go and paddle my stand-up paddleboard. But kids they don't have, I guess, the same sort of options unless the adults who are around them exposing them to it. So I really hope that I can continue to expose my kids to it as well, because, again, being part of nature, being part of the outdoors, just like it benefits us as adults, it benefits the kids tenfold.
Yeah, I think that I can hear it in your voice is that you're out on the mega expedition, but you're kind of taking back a different message and applying it now to your own children. And if you can get people out even for a week or two in nature themselves as adults, they'll remember what it was like as kids and bring it to their own kids.
Oh, for sure. After the time that I spent paddling across the US, I fell in love with Montana, and I'm trying to figure out ways where I can spend extended periods of time in the US, and particularly Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Washington, Pacific Northwest, all those sorts of places. And so I keep a close eye on all the outdoors going on, and I see a lot of organizations that really try hard, I think, to encourage adults and children to get outside, and for example, in Montana, the National Park Services there, I've just seen the sort of the opportunities to go and visit these national parks that particularly in the US that you guys have, and to me it just blows my mind. I can to think offhand some of the world class or top of the class sort of national parks that people in the US have access to, and it just blows my mind. So I get so jealous that for a lot of people it's right on their doorstep, and if they can just take a weekend to go visit, just for a weekend, I'm sure for so many people, not everyone maybe, I have friends who dig being inside, but certainly I think for a vast majority of people, if they can get this exposure to some of these places in the US, Patagonia, in Russia as well, these wild places in Russia, my gosh, then certainly they can take away from that so many things. It just blows my mind.
This has been great. I think that your message is fantastic. I've had a lot of fun having this conversation. And so for the Seven Rivers, Seven Continents project, as we wrap up, we've covered a lot of ground between,
for sure,
your the four that you've accomplished so far, and you're halfway there. We talked about kids and adults getting out, a little bit about your future projects. I'm really curious, as we wrap up, what message do you want people to take away for, and not only the message you want them to take away, how can they track you and follow you as you move throughout the next couple of years wrapping this project up?
For me, I guess the main sort of portal for my Seven Rivers project is the website, sevenrivers7continents.com. That changes depending on the river. So, when I did the Missouri, Mississippi, it was dedicated to that. Now it's more so was dedicated to the Volga, and there's quite a few photos and things up on the Volga, and then in another part of the website is a lot of photos and particularly a lot of stories from the US. So certainly the website, I guess, is the main sort of area where I put a lot of images and things like that. I use social media a bit. I mean, I don't know. I guess for me, I'm really sort of torn with the whole social media thing. In that, I guess some of the most interesting people I know when it comes to whether it's outdoors or anything, you won't find them on Facebook, you won't find them on Twitter because they're too busy doing stuff. They're too busy being outside. But then on the other hand, as well, I know a lot of outdoor athletes and sort of outdoor sort of advocates who also make or are very smart or make very good use of social media to show people what they're doing and also introduce people to the sort of, I guess, the amazing places and the amazing things that they're going to see. So I definitely use Twitter. I definitely use Facebook as well. But I'd like to think that I use them sparingly. But they certainly have their place.
Well, I'm definitely going to put on the show notes links for people to reach your main site, which is themarkculch.com, and then also the Seven Rivers Project. So I'll put links so that people can find that and learn, and keep track of you and learn more about your work. I really enjoyed the time we spent together today, and I wish you the best as you finish your quest.
Cheers, Bill. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to chat.
Well, this wraps up episode 23 with Mark Culch. I hope you have a very different perspective now on how you can tackle your own adventures in your life and with your families. Possibly this interview spurs you to pull yourself a bit above the rat race and try something different over the next 12 to 18 months. Or maybe you're motivated to take action and possibly increase the adventure dial a little bit in your own life. Good luck, and see you at episode 24. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.